next pot I'm going to make is a bread plate or a lunch plate. I'm working with 4.5 pounds of clay. I've always found it difficult or challenging to make a bread plate or a dinner plate or platter that tied into the rest of my work because it's difficult to stretch volume into a plate the way I do on my other forms. The solution I've developed has been to cut the rim and create an undulating rhythm around the edge of the form. I always throw plates on an absorbent bat, and anything larger than this size plate I would throw on plaster to make it dry out a little bit faster. By wetting just a circle of the bat, that also helps me position the ball of clay in the middle of the bat. I like to do as much centering as I can before I turn my wheel on. And my primary focus when I center something low and wide for a plate is that I don't trap slurry or water or air in any area between the bat and the clay. So I'm going to lead with the bottom part of the clay spreading out before the top of the clay. To do that, I'm going to position my left hand so that it's firm against the clay at the top, but there's a space at the bottom for the clay to move into. And then I'm going to push down and in from the top corner to encourage that spreading of clay. And it may take some time to figure out just how wide you want to center a plate so you have enough support for it to spread out into an even curve, but not so much clay at the bottom that it's not really doing anything for the form. What's hard for some people to kind of grasp is that this edge right here is eventually going to be the rim of my plate. And so I want to make sure as I pull this open that I don't fold this clay over and create kind of an air pocket that when I go to do a pull will give me problems. So as I'm pulling, my thumb is giving just really light compression in this area to keep the clay kind of tight and together. And I stop along the way and recompress this rim as I go. And that's usually a good time to stop and measure my thickness. And I can see I've already pushed a little bit of clay back into the middle, and that's helpful to know. So before I open too far, I can go back and open a little deeper again. My goal here is to open the plate with a very low continuous curve. I don't want it to be flat with a rim. The reason for that continuous curve is really two-part. One's aesthetic. I just like the way a continuous curve looks versus a flat plate. And the other is structural, that it becomes kind of an inverted arch and it prevents the plate from sagging during firing. And that's especially important for porcelain plates, which do like to settle down in the kiln. And so every time I want to open a little further, you'll notice I still start at the beginning, at the middle, and work my way out. And that's a good way to maintain that curve. This is where you can have problems, and so I pay a little bit extra attention to compressing this clay into itself and avoiding a seam. So I should see, as I move my needle tool out, the thickness getting greater and greater. And when I'm all the way open, I spend a little time recompressing this rim, which gets it back into center and makes it easier to do the first pull. As you work a plate, they have a tendency to kind of lay down anyway, but I'm also going to finish the surface of this plate by pressing with a rib to make a mark. And so I throw plates and platters a little bit closer to a shallow bowl than a plate at first, and then I lay it down with a rib at the end. It's much easier to lay a plate down than to try to lift it back up after it started to drop. I like to start these pulls again from the center rather than just from this edge. This area right here where you start to lose support on the underside is usually where you would develop the beginner's hump that once you get into a plate is really hard to get out. So by moving through that area with light pressure several times, it's much easier to get the continuous curve I want than trying to be too aggressive and forcing the clay out in one big pull. Before I cut the rim, it's helpful to pass over the surface a few times with a rib. And so when I like to start from the rim and move inward, I feel like this part has the least amount of structural integrity right now. And sometimes when I end a pull at that point, my hand might be a little shaky, or I might have kind of found myself holding my breath and lost control a little bit. So if I start with that trickier area, it's really easy to compress down into this thicker, structurally sound center of the plate. This process also slightly begins the laying down of the rim, but most importantly, it removes some of the excess slurry, which is really important to do before I cut the rim. Because if the plate's really wet and I cut the rim, that cut clay wants to stick back to the plate. I'm going to cut the rim with a cheese slicer that I've removed the rolling bar from so that I can cut a little thicker than it's usually set for. And I'm going to make this cut with a bouncing motion of this wire and try to divide the piece visually again into sort of soft thirds. If that's hard to visualize while the plate's spinning, you can make little marks in the rim. And then as the wheel spins, your eye will catch those little shadows and tell you when to move up and down. It's important to make sure the wheel's spinning fast enough that you get a continuous cut, but slow enough that you can really gauge your proportions. And I usually do 2 simple in-out cuts and then one with a little bit of waviness to it. The next step is to compress this rim back into kind of a curved bevel shape instead of this hard cut edge. So to compress this rim away from this cut edge and into more of a tapered edge, I hold my sponge so that the rim of the plate fits in this unsupported area, and I have one finger slightly below the rim and another finger slightly above the rim. And I usually do 1 or 2 more pulls after I cut the rim. And that kind of softens the cut. And having that extra thickness was helpful at that stage, but for the final plate, I don't need it that thick. I also sometimes do a pull of sorts with a rib on the inside. So I'm going to support the outside with my left hand, and I'm going to kind of dig into the clay with this rib and really pull some of that thickness into this hand. I'm just going to remove any extra slurry with my chamois. And this is kind of similar to the cups. I start with a wooden rib, and then I move to this flexible steel rib, and I'm going to finish at the very end with the flexible rubber rib. And these plates are usually a little bit more upright than I want the finished piece to be, and I need that upright property to be able to press down. If it's really flat and I try to press with my rib, it's likely to collapse. So instead I get the mark I want now, and then maybe in 20 or 30 minutes I'll put the plate back on the wheel and lay down the rim a little bit more. So it's fairly arbitrary, but lately I've been preferring a mark that starts at the outside and moves in. And the mark doesn't really come from the edge of the rib, it comes from where the point of contact stops touching the plate. So this section of the rib is compressing, and this section is mark making. When I throw plates and platters on plaster, I don't pass a wire underneath because the plaster is going to pull the moisture out of the clay and the plate should just pop off the bat. When I'm on masonite like this, I do want to cut it off, but probably not until the plate is stiff enough that I can remove it from the bat.